Scary story: monsters in the forest. Okay, buckle up. Here's a long and hopefully creepy story about monsters in the woods, with English names and reaching the 15,000 character mark. The biting wind howled through the skeletal branches of the Blackwood Forest, a sound that clawed at Amelia's sanity. She clutched her father's worn compass, the needle spinning erratically, mocking her desperation. She was hopelessly lost. It had started innocently enough. A weekend camping trip with her older brother, Thomas, to reconnect before he shipped off for his final semester at university. They were both avid hikers, Blackwood Forest a local legend, beautiful but treacherous. Thomas, always the daredevil, had convinced her to venture off the marked trail, promising a hidden waterfall he'd heard whispers about from the locals. Then the fog rolled in. Thick and impenetrable, it swallowed the sunlight and muted all sound except for the unsettling rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. They'd argued, voices tight with fear and frustration. Thomas, blaming her for their predicament, Amelia, furious at his recklessness. Then, a sound. A guttural growl that sent shivers down their spines. They ran. Amelia had stumbled, twisting her ankle. Thomas, in his panic, hadn't noticed. When she finally managed to hobble to the spot where they'd separated, he was gone. Now, hours later, the forest had transformed into a living nightmare. The trees, gnarled and ancient, seemed to leer at her. The air hung heavy with a cloying, metallic scent, like blood mixed with decay. She'd been calling Thomas's name, but only the echo answered, distorted and unsettling. Suddenly, a twig snapped nearby. Amelia froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She gripped the small hunting knife her father had given her for her 16th birthday, a useless weapon against whatever lurked in the shadows. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling. Silence. Then, another snap, closer this time. Amelia spun around, her eyes straining to pierce the gloom. She saw nothing. "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. A low, rasping chuckle echoed through the trees, a sound that seemed to vibrate deep within her bones. It wasn't human. She backed away slowly, her injured ankle screaming in protest. She had to get out of here. But which way? The compass was useless, the forest disorienting. Then she saw it. A flicker of movement in the periphery, a dark shape shifting between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form indistinct in the gloom. It seemed to ripple, its edges blurring like a heat haze. Fear, raw and primal, seized Amelia. She turned and ran, ignoring the searing pain in her ankle. She plunged deeper into the woods, desperate to escape whatever was pursuing her. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead. She collapsed against a thick, moss-covered tree, gasping for air. She peered back, but saw nothing. Had she lost it? As she caught her breath, she noticed something else. Scrawled on the trunk of the tree, in what looked like dried blood, were symbols. Strange, angular shapes that seemed both familiar and deeply unsettling. She recognized one of them, a distorted version of a symbol she'd seen in an old book about folklore and local legends of the forest. They were warnings to never venture into the Darkwood during the autumn solstice, the time of the Veil of the Fallen. A wave of dread washed over her. This wasn't just a forest. It was something else, something ancient and malevolent. Suddenly, the air grew colder, the metallic scent intensified. The trees around her seemed to press in, their branches reaching out like grasping claws. Then she heard it again. The rasping chuckle, closer this time. She looked up. Standing before her, partially concealed by the shadows, was a creature unlike anything she had ever imagined. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but impossibly gaunt, its limbs elongated and unnaturally twisted. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched taut over sharp bones. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were two glowing embers burning with malevolent intelligence. But the most horrifying thing about it was its mouth. A gaping maw filled with rows upon rows of razor-sharp teeth, extending far beyond the boundaries of a normal human jaw. The creature took a step closer. Amelia scrambled back, pressing herself against the tree. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. Then, another sound. A chorus of growls, coming from all directions. Amelia realized she wasn't alone. There were more of them. The creature in front of her raised a long, skeletal hand, its fingers tipped with sharp claws. It opened its horrifying mouth and let out a deafening shriek, a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality. Amelia closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable. But then, a new sound. A sharp crack, followed by a roar of pain. She opened her eyes to see a figure standing between her and the creature. It was Thomas. He was holding a makeshift torch, the flames casting dancing shadows on his face. He looked terrified, but determined. "Run, Amelia," he yelled. "Get out of here." He swung the torch at the creature, which recoiled with a hiss. The other creatures, alerted by the commotion, began to close in. Amelia knew she couldn't leave him, but she also knew that she couldn't fight. Her ankle was too injured, her weapon too small. Then, she remembered the symbols. The warnings, the folklore. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the pain. She ran towards the creature, her knife held high. "You want me?" she screamed. "Come and get me." She plunged the knife into the tree trunk, right next to the symbols. She didn't know why she was doing it, but she had a feeling that it was important. As the knife pierced the wood, the air crackled with energy. The symbols began to glow with an eerie light. The creatures hissed and recoiled, their glowing eyes shrinking in fear. The tree itself seemed to tremble, its branches swaying wildly. Then, with a deafening roar, the ground began to shake. Emilia and Thomas stumbled back, shielding their eyes from the blinding light. When they could see again, the creatures were gone. The forest was silent. The glowing symbols on the tree trunk slowly faded, leaving behind only the faint scent of ozone. Emilia and Thomas stood there, breathless and shaken, trying to comprehend what had just happened. "What was that?" Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Emilia said, "but I think we just pissed off something really powerful." They knew they had to get out of the forest and never return. They followed the faint glimmer of moonlight filtering through the trees, relying on Emilia's faltering compass and the faint memory of the path they had taken. It was now a race against time. The Blackwood Forest wasn't finished with them. As they limped through the undergrowth, branches snagged at their clothes, the air seemed to grow heavy. They were being watched. They could feel it. A sense of immense and ancient evil lurked just beyond the edge of vision. Then they heard it again. The guttural growl, much closer this time. "They're still following us," Thomas gasped, glancing over his shoulder. "We need to find the edge of the forest," Emilia said, her voice tight with fear. "The symbols, they seem to protect us within a certain area. We need to get out of that area." As they stumbled on, they began to see signs that they were not alone. Twisted and broken branches, patches of ground that looked as if something heavy had been dragged across them. And worst of all, a scattering of bones. Human bones. Emilia's heart pounded in her chest. The legends of the Blackwood Forest weren't just stories. They were warnings. They pressed on, driven by adrenaline and terror. Then they came to a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a towering oak tree, its branches reaching up to the sky like skeletal fingers. Around the base of the tree were piled stones in strange and complex formations. This was no ordinary tree. It was a focus, a nexus point for the evil that permeated the forest. As they watched, the stones began to glow with an eerie, pulsating light. The air crackled with energy. The trees around them seemed to writhe and twist. Then, from the shadows beneath the tree, they emerged. Not just the gaunt, grey creatures they had seen before, but a whole host of horrors. Creatures of nightmare, with twisted limbs, glowing eyes, and razor-sharp teeth. There were hulking, bear-like beasts with matted fur and dripping claws, gaunt, skeletal figures with elongated limbs and mouths that seemed to stretch beyond their faces, and smaller, goblin-like creatures with sharp, needle-like teeth and glowing red eyes. They were surrounded. Thomas grabbed a fallen branch and held it like a club. Emilia clutched her knife, her hand trembling. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and trapped. Then, one of the creatures stepped forward. It was the tallest of the gaunt figures, its eyes burning with an unnatural intelligence. It raised a long, skeletal hand and spoke, its voice a rasping whisper that seemed to echo in their minds. "You have trespassed," it said. "You have disturbed the Ancient Ones. Now you will pay the price." Emilia and Thomas stood there, frozen with fear, waiting for the inevitable. But then, something extraordinary happened. Emilia remembered the words of her grandmother, who had lived near the Blackwood Forest for many years. She had told Emilia stories of the forest, of the creatures that lived there, and of the ancient magic that protected it. She had told Emilia that the forest only takes what it needs, and that those who respect it will be safe. Emilia took a deep breath and closed her eyes. She thought of her grandmother, of her stories, of the forest itself. She focused all her energy on the image of peace, of respect, of harmony. Then, she opened her eyes and spoke. "We are sorry," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We didn't mean to disturb you. We didn't know. We will leave now, and we will never return. We promise to respect the forest and its secrets." The creature stared at her, its glowing eyes piercing her soul. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the creature lowered its hand. "Leave," it said, its voice barely audible, "and never return." Emilia and Thomas didn't hesitate. They turned and ran, pushing their way through the undergrowth, desperate to escape the clearing and the horrors that lurked within. They ran until they reached the edge of the forest, until the trees thinned out and the sunlight began to filter through the branches. They stumbled out into a familiar field, gasping for air and trembling with fear. They looked back at the Blackwood Forest, its dark trees looming like a silent warning. They knew that they had narrowly escaped a terrible fate, and that they would never forget what they had seen. As they walked away, Emilia glanced at her compass. The needle, once spinning erratically, now pointed steadily north. They were safe, for now, but the chilling memory of the creatures and the forest will never leave them. From that day on, neither Emilia nor Thomas ever wandered off the marked trails again. The forest held secrets best left undisturbed, and the price for curiosity was far too high to pay. The sun beat down on their faces, a stark contrast to the chilling darkness they had just escaped. The familiar scent of grass and earth filled their lungs, a welcome change from the metallic tang of blood and decay that still clung to their clothes and hair. They walked in silence for a long time, each lost in their own thoughts. Thomas, usually so boisterous and confident, was subdued and withdrawn. Emilia, despite her injured ankle, felt a strange sense of resolve. She had faced something terrifying, something ancient and powerful, and she had survived. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice barely a whisper. What were those things? Emilia shook her head. I don't know. My grandmother used to tell stories about the Blackwood Forest. She said it was alive, that it protected itself. Protected itself with that? Thomas asked, his voice rising in disbelief. Those things were monsters. We could have died. We almost did, Emilia said, her voice firm. But we didn't, and maybe that's because we showed respect. We apologized. We promised to leave it alone. Thomas looked at her skeptically. You really believe that? Emilia shrugged. I don't know what else to believe. But I do know that we need to tell someone about this. Warn people. Thomas hesitated. Who's going to believe us? They'll think we're crazy. Monsters in the woods. It sounds like something out of a bad horror movie. Emilia sighed. He had a point, but she couldn't just ignore what had happened. She felt a responsibility to warn others, to protect him from the horrors of the Blackwood Forest. Maybe we don't have to tell everyone everything, she said. Maybe we can just warn people to stay on the marked trails, to not go wandering off into the deep woods. Thomas nodded slowly. Okay, I can do that. I can tell people to be careful. They limped back to their campsite, packed up the gear, and headed back to town. The closer they got to civilization, the more the memory of the forest seemed to fade, to become something unreal, like a nightmare. But Emilia knew it wasn't a dream. She could still smell the metallic scent of blood and decay. She could still hear the rasping chuckle of the creatures. She could still see the glowing eyes burning in the darkness. Back in town, they told their story to the local park ranger, a grizzled old man named Mr. Hemlock. He listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When they were finished, he nodded slowly. I've heard stories about those woods, he said. Been working here for 30 years, and I've heard all sorts of things. People disappearing, strange noises, weird lights in the sky. But I've never seen anything myself. We did, Emilia said, her voice trembling. We saw them. They're real. Mr. Hemlock sighed. I believe you, but there's not much I can do. I can't close the forest. People have a right to hike wherever they want. All I can do is warn them. Tell them to be careful. He promised to put up extra warning signs, to remind people to stay on the marked trails. Emilia and Thomas thanked him and left, feeling a little relieved, but still uneasy. Days turned into weeks. Thomas shipped off to university, and Emilia returned to her normal life. But the memory of the Blackwood Forest lingered, a constant reminder of the horrors they had faced. One evening, Emilia was sitting in her room, reading a book about folklore and legends. She came across a passage about the Blackwood Forest, about the creatures that lived there, and about the ancient magic that protected it. She realized that the symbols she had seen on the tree trunk were not just warnings. They were also a form of protection, a way to ward off evil. And then, she remembered something else. Her grandmother's stories. She had told Emilia that the forest only takes what it needs. Emilia realized that the creatures hadn't attacked them simply because they had trespassed. They had attacked them because they had disturbed something important. She had to go back. She knew it was dangerous, perhaps even suicidal, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had to do something. She had to understand what had happened in the forest, and she had to find a way to protect it. The next morning, Emilia packed a backpack with supplies and headed back to the Blackwood Forest. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She knew they would try to stop her. She walked carefully, staying on the marked trails, avoiding the areas where they had seen the creatures. She carried her father's knife and a small notebook where she could write down her observations. She spent days in the forest, studying the trees, the plants, the animals. She learned about the history of the forest, about the people who had lived there, and about the legends that had been passed down through generations. She discovered that the forest was indeed alive, in a way that she had never imagined. It was a complex ecosystem, a delicate balance of nature and magic. And she realized that the creatures were not just monsters. They were guardians, protectors of the forest. She also discovered the source of the forest's power, a hidden spring deep within the woods where the water flowed with an unnatural energy. It was this spring that fueled the magic of the forest, that sustained the creatures, and that protected it from harm. One day, as she was exploring near the spring, she came across a group of people. They were tourists, hikers who had wandered off the marked trails. They were polluting the spring, throwing trash into the water, disturbing the delicate ecosystem. Emilia tried to warn them, to tell them about the dangers of the forest. But they